In the shadow of Mount Aegatus, a nightmare was born. Around 743 BC, the warrior city of Sparta made a decision that would haunt them for centuries. They didn't just defeat their neighbours, they enslaved an entire nation. The Messenians became Helots, a permanent underclass outnumbering their Spartan masters by ratios estimated as high as 7-1. This wasn't just conquest. This was the creation of a ticking time bomb that would force Sparta to transform into the most brutal military machine the ancient world had ever seen. What you think you know about Sparta, the discipline, the warriors, the fearsome reputation, it all began here, in blood, terror, and unimaginable paranoia. Before we dive into the brutal origin of the Spartan war machine, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden beneath history's most legendary civilizations, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We're uncovering the stories that textbooks won't tell you, the violence, the desperation, and the savage choices that forged empires. Support the channel by liking this video, and let's explore together how fear can reshape an entire society. This is not the Sparta you learned about in school. Forget the glory. Forget the heroism. The true story of Sparta begins with a crime so monstrous it would define their existence for half a millennium. Around 743 BC, Sparta faced a problem that many ancient cities confronted: overpopulation and land scarcity. Their rocky valley along the Eurotas River could barely sustain their growing population of Spartan citizens, but their solution was unprecedented in its brutality. They looked west across the Taygetus Mountains to the fertile plains of Messenia, a rich agricultural region inhabited by fellow Greeks, the Messenians, who had lived on that land for generations. These were not barbarians. They were Greeks who spoke a dialect similar to Sparta's own, who worshipped the same gods, who traced their ancestry back to the same heroic age. But none of that mattered. Sparta didn't want an alliance. They didn't want tribute. They wanted everything. What followed was the First Messenian War, a 20-year campaign of conquest and subjugation that would create the Helot system, reducing an entire free population to hereditary slavery. The Spartans redistributed Messenian estates among their soldiers, but they didn't just take the land. They enslaved the people who worked it, forcing them to surrender half of everything they produced. The Helots were bound to the soil their ancestors had owned, generation after generation, with no hope of freedom. But conquering Messenia solved one problem while creating a far more terrifying one. The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. Ancient sources suggest ratios as high as 7-1, and unlike other slaves scattered across the Greek world, the Helots lived together in their ancestral communities, spoke the same language, remembered their freedom, and nursed a burning hatred for their oppressors. The ancient historian Thucydides would later write that all Spartan policy was governed by one overwhelming emotion: fear of the Helots. Every law, every custom, every aspect of Spartan life would eventually be twisted around this singular terror, the nightmare that one day the volcano would erupt. This is the story of how that fear was born, how it consumed an entire civilization, and how it created an army of supermen. But it's also the story of a people who refused to forget, who passed down their hatred like an inheritance, and who would nearly destroy Sparta in their quest for freedom. This is the brutal origin story that explains everything you thought you knew about ancient Greece's most legendary warriors. To understand why Sparta committed this crime, you need to understand the geography that imprisoned them. Sparta occupied the Eurotas River Valley in Laconia, a region hemmed in by mountains on all sides. To the west rose the imposing spine of the Taygetus Range, peaks reaching over 7,000 feet that created a natural fortress, but also a natural prison. To the east lay less dramatic but still significant mountains that separated Sparta from the Aegean coast. This geography gave Sparta natural defences but strangled their agricultural potential. The valley floor could support only so many people, and by the mid-8th century BC, Sparta was running out of room. Most Greek cities facing this problem sent out colonies, establishing new settlements across the Mediterranean from Sicily to the Black Sea. Syracuse, Tarentum, Byzantium. These were the daughter cities of overpopulated Greek states seeking new land for their excess population. But Sparta looked at colonization and saw weakness. Sending away citizens meant fragmenting your military strength, creating distant settlements that might one day become rivals or simply refuse to send aid when you needed it most. The Spartan military mindset was already developing, already valuing concentrated power over dispersed influence, so they looked west, across the Taygetus Mountains to Messenia. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Where Sparta's valley was narrow and constrained, Messenia spread out in broad, fertile plains watered by multiple rivers. The Pamisos River created rich agricultural bottomlands. The climate was gentler, the soil deeper, the harvest more abundant. Ancient sources describe Messenia as one of the most fertile regions in all of Greece. Its fields produced grain in quantities Spartan farmers could only dream of, olive groves that stretched for miles, vineyards that yielded wine praised across the Greek world. And all of this bounty belonged to the Messenians, a people who traced their ancestry back to the legendary hero Neleus and beyond, to the Mycenaean kingdoms that had ruled Greece before the Trojan War. The Messenians weren't barbarians or foreigners, they were Achaean Greeks who had inhabited this land for centuries, maintaining the old traditions even as Dorian invaders had established new kingdoms elsewhere in the Peloponnese. Their capital, Sthenekleros, controlled a prosperous agricultural economy. Mount Ithome, rising in the centre of their territory, held an ancient shrine to Zeus Ithomatus that had been sacred since time immemorial. The Messenians considered themselves free people, citizens of an independent kingdom, protected by their traditions and their gods. They had no idea what was coming. When one of the Spartan kings was asked why Sparta needed to go to war against fellow Dorians who had settled in Messenia, his answer was chillingly pragmatic. All we want is land not yet distributed, that is not yet divided by lot for our people. It wasn't about honour, it wasn't about divine mandate or ancient grievances, it was about land, resources, and the cold calculation that taking what someone else had built was easier than building it yourself. The Spartans had already instituted their unique constitution, the system attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, which divided all Spartan land into equal plots called kleroi. Each Spartan citizen needed a kleros to maintain his citizenship status, but there weren't enough plots in Laconia for a growing population, so they would take Messenia's fields, Messenia's wealth, and Messenia's future, and if the Messenians wouldn't leave peacefully, Sparta would make them slaves. The war began not with a declaration but with a massacre. Around 743 BC, under the command of King Alcmenes of the Aegeid royal line, a Spartan force assembled in secret and marched through the night. Their target was Ampheia, a Messenian border town perched somewhere on the western slopes of Taygetus. The Spartans had sworn an oath before departing. They would not stop fighting until they had conquered all of Messenia, no matter how long it took, no matter how many died, no matter the cost. It was a vow that bound an entire generation to war. The night march brought them to Ampheia's gates just before dawn. The gates stood open. There was no garrison, no sentries, no warning of any kind. Messenia and Sparta had not been at war. There had been tensions, certainly. Cattle theft, accusations of murder, the usual border friction between neighbouring states, but nothing that suggested imminent invasion. The first sign the people of Ampheia had that the world had changed was Spartan soldiers kicking down their doors. The massacre was systematic and brutal. Spartans roused families from their beds and cut them down in their homes. Those who fled into the streets were hunted through the pre-dawn darkness. Some managed to reach the temples, throwing themselves on the altars and begging for sanctuary, the ancient Greek custom that made religious spaces inviolable even in wartime. But the Spartans were already demonstrating the pragmatic brutality that would define their approach to Messenia. They dragged suppliants from the altars and killed them where they knelt. By sunrise, Ampheia had ceased to exist as a Messenian town. The Spartans captured the women and children, enslaving them, while many surviving men were reportedly sold into slavery. They turned the town itself into a forward garrison, a dagger pointed at the heart of Messenia. Word of the atrocity spread like wildfire across the Messenian plains. Refugees from Ampheia who had escaped the slaughter staggered into villages and cities with horrifying tales. The Spartans had come without warning, without mercy, and they had declared by their actions that this would be a war of annihilation. At the capital Stenikleros, King Euphias addressed a crowd that had gathered from across Messenia, citizen soldiers responding to the emergency muster. Pausanias preserves the spirit of his speech. Euphias told his people that justice was on their side, that the gods would favour those who had been attacked first rather than the aggressors, that Messenian courage would prevail against Spartan treachery. It was the kind of speech leaders give when they need to transform fear into fury, when they need farmers to become soldiers overnight. But Euphias also demonstrated strategic wisdom that would characterise much of the Messenian resistance. He immediately placed the entire male population under arms and began an intensive training program. He fortified every town, garrisoning them with citizen militias, and most importantly, he refused to give the Spartans what they wanted: a decisive field battle where Sparta's professional military could destroy Messenia's hastily assembled forces in a single afternoon. For 2 full campaigning seasons, the war settled into a frustrating pattern for the Spartans. They raided from their base at Ampheia, sweeping across the Messenian plains to confiscate grain stores and seize portable wealth. But they had been given strict orders: do not destroy buildings, do not burn olive groves, do not raze the towns. The Spartan command knew from the beginning what they intended. This wasn't a punitive expedition. This was a war of conquest and colonization. They wanted Messenia intact so they could take it over, so they could redistribute its estates to Spartan soldiers as rewards. Burning the prize before claiming it made no sense. The Messenians, for their part, avoided direct confrontation. Their fortified towns became nodes in a defensive network that the Spartans couldn't crack. Sparta lacked the siege equipment and the patience for prolonged sieges of multiple fortified positions. Meanwhile, Messenian forces struck at undefended Spartan border settlements when opportunities arose, quick raids designed to drain Spartan morale and resources. By the 4th campaigning season, 739 BC, by the traditional dating, Euphias decided the strategic stalemate was untenable. The Spartans were bleeding Messenia dry with their raids, denying the Messenians access to their own fields during planting and harvest seasons. If this continued, Messenia would starve even if the Spartans never won a battle. Euphias judged his citizen soldiers had trained enough to face Spartan professionals. He assembled an expedition and marched east from Stenikleros toward Ampheia. But this wasn't a reckless assault. His baggage train carried timber and stockade materials. He intended to build a fortified forward camp closer to the Spartan base, establishing a new start line for offensive operations. It was the kind of methodical, tactical thinking that would later become standard Roman military doctrine. But the Spartans had been tracking his every movement. They sent urgent word back to Sparta for reinforcements and marched to intercept the Messenian column somewhere between Mount Itome and the Taygetus range. Euphias saw them coming. He chose his ground with brilliant tactical precision, positioning his army on one side of an impassable ravine with the Spartans on the other. The Spartan commanders immediately understood what Euphias was doing. He was buying time to build his fortified camp, using the ravine as a natural defensive barrier. They sent a flanking force upstream to find a crossing point, but Euphias had anticipated exactly this move. He dispatched 500 cavalry and light infantry under commanders named Pitheratos and Antandros, who shadowed the Spartan flanking force along the opposite bank, preventing them from crossing at any point. The Messenians worked through the day and night. By the following dawn, the fortified camp stood complete. The Spartans had been outmaneuvered. The ravine still separated the armies. The Messenian camp was now a hardened position, and attempting an assault across difficult terrain against prepared defences would be suicide even for Spartan troops. They withdrew back toward Amphia, and Messenia celebrated what could reasonably be called a tactical victory. They had denied the Spartans battle, completed their objective, and demonstrated that Messenian generalship could match Spartan military professionalism. But both sides knew this was temporary. The strategic situation hadn't changed. Sparta still occupied Messenian territory, still had the resources for a long war, and still had no intention of stopping until Messenia belonged to them. The next campaigning season would bring the reckoning. When the armies met again the following year on the plains beneath Taygetus, everything had changed. King Alcmenes had died and been succeeded by his son Polydorus, a younger and more aggressive commander. The Messenian commander Cleonis led his forces east from the fortified camp to meet the advancing Spartan army. They encountered each other somewhere near Amphia, though the exact location is lost to history. Both sides deployed in traditional formation, heavy infantry in the centre and on the flanks, with light troops and archers in supporting positions. Euphes commanded the Messenian left flank with Antandros, Cleonis held the centre, and Pithratos anchored the right. Facing them across the field were Polydorus on the Spartan left, the noble Eurylion commanding the centre, and King Theopompus on the right. The speeches before battle reveal the fundamental difference in how each side saw the conflict. Theopompus appealed to glory, to wealth, to the sacred oath every Spartan soldier had sworn to conquer Messenia or die trying. He promised riches beyond imagining and eternal fame. Euphaeus pointed at the ruins of Amphia, at the smoke still rising from raided villages, at the enslaved prisoners whose fate awaited every Messenian if they lost. His message was stark: victory or slavery. There was no middle ground. At the signal, both armies advanced. What followed was a study in contrasting military philosophies. The Messenians fought with desperate courage, individual warriors breaking ranks to perform acts of heroic valour, charging recklessly into the Spartan lines, trading their lives for small tactical advantages. They fought like heroes from the epic poems, like Achilles and Hector before the walls of Troy. The Spartans fought like a machine. They maintained formation, their lines unbreakable, their discipline absolute. Pausanias describes them as careful not to break rank, maintaining a deep formation that created an impenetrable wall of bronze and iron. This was the phalanx, the revolutionary military formation that would dominate Greek warfare for centuries, and the First Messenian War provides some of the earliest historical evidence of its use. 8 ranks deep, shields overlapping, spears projecting forward in a forest of death, the Spartan phalanx advanced with mechanical precision. When Messenian warriors broke from their lines in individual charges, they simply died on Spartan spears. When Messenians tried to loot the fallen between the battle lines, they were speared and stabbed while they were too busy to see what was coming. The phalanx didn't care about individual heroism, it cared about mass, discipline, and relentless forward pressure. Hour after hour the battle continued, and slowly, inevitably, the Messenian lines began to crack under the grinding pressure of Spartan discipline. By day's end, the field belonged to Sparta. In the aftermath of the battle, Euphaes made the hardest decision of his life. The Messenians could not win in open battle against the Spartan phalanx. Their courage wasn't in question. They had fought with suicidal bravery. But courage alone couldn't overcome the systematic military superiority Sparta had achieved. If they continued fighting conventional battles, Sparta would grind them down, engagement by engagement, until no Messenian army remained. So Euphaes retreated to Mount Ithome, the sacred mountain at the heart of Messenia, where Zeus Ithomatas had been worshipped since before living memory, Ithome, wasn't just spiritually significant, it was a natural fortress. The mountain rose steep and formidable from the surrounding plains, its slopes difficult for any attacker to climb, its summit providing commanding views in all directions. Euphase fortified the mountain heavily, turning it into the centre of Messenian resistance. From this point forward, the war would become a siege, and sieges favoured the defender. Years passed. The Spartans raided the plains but couldn't dislodge the Messenians from Ithome. They tried assaults up the slopes and were repulsed with heavy casualties. The mountain became a symbol of Messenian defiance, proof that Sparta's military might had limits. But symbols don't feed people, and as the siege dragged on, the situation inside the fortress grew desperate. The Messenians sent a delegation to consult the oracle at Delphi, the priestess of Apollo, whose prophecies guided Greek decision-making on matters of war, colonization, and divine will. The oracle's response was horrifying. Victory required the sacrifice of a royal virgin. According to tradition, the daughter of Aristodemus, a respected Messenian noble and warrior, was selected. What happened next reveals the psychological horror of protracted war. Aristodemus, a man who embodied Messenian resistance, who had fought the Spartans for years, was now being asked to sacrifice his own daughter to save his nation. The sources don't describe his inner torment, but his actions speak volumes. He consented to the sacrifice, and his daughter was killed on the sacred altars of Mount Ithome. When the Spartans learned of the sacrifice, they pulled back from Ithome for several years. Whether this was superstitious fear of divine intervention or simply strategic reassessment, the ancient sources don't clarify, but the respite didn't last. The Spartans regrouped, consulted their own oracles, and launched a renewed offensive. They stormed the Messenian fortifications on Ithome and killed the current Messenian commander in brutal hand-to-hand fighting on the mountain slopes. In the leadership crisis that followed, Aristodemus, the man who had sacrificed his daughter for victory, was proclaimed the new king of Messenia. It was a desperate move, elevating a military hero to royal status in hopes his leadership could somehow salvage a deteriorating situation. And initially it worked. Aristodemus led a fierce counteroffensive that drove Spartan forces back into Laconian territory. For a brief moment it seemed the sacrifice had indeed brought divine favour, that Messenia might yet survive. But the Spartans, demonstrating the patient brutality that would characterise their approach to war, sent their own envoys to Delphi. Whatever advice the oracle provided, it worked. The Spartans implemented new strategies. The sources frustratingly don't specify what they were, that caused a cascade of Messenian defeats. Supply lines into Ithome were cut. Reinforcements were intercepted. The cordon around the mountain tightened like a noose. Inside the fortress, Aristodemus watched everything he had sacrificed for crumble into dust. His daughter had died for nothing. The divine favour hadn't materialised. Messenia was losing despite his leadership, despite his courage, despite his unimaginable sacrifice. The psychological weight crushed him. Aristodemus went to his daughter's tomb, drew his sword, and killed himself. His suicide wasn't just personal despair. It was a statement of absolute defeat. A king acknowledging that there was no path to victory, no strategy left to try, no hope left to cling to. The collapse came swiftly after Aristodemus died. Around 724 BC, in the first year of the 14th Olympiad, Mount Ithome fell to the Spartans. 20 years after the war began with the massacre at Amphia, it ended with Spartan soldiers planting their banners on the sacred summit where Zeus Ithomatus had been worshipped for generations. The Messenians faced an impossible choice. They could flee abroad, abandoning their ancestral homeland to become refugees dependent on the charity of foreign cities, or they could surrender and accept whatever terms the Spartans dictated. Some chose exile. Messenian refugees scattered across Greece to Arcadia and Argos, and distant cities that would accept displaced people. But most stayed, because leaving meant severing every connection to the land their ancestors had farmed, the graves where their families were buried, the temples where they worshipped. They stayed because Messenia was their home, even if it had been conquered. The Spartans began the systematic colonization they had planned from the beginning. Every Messenian estate was confiscated. The land was surveyed, divided, and redistributed to Spartan soldiers as rewards for their service. The plots were called kleroi, inalienable holdings that defined Spartan citizenship. The ancient historian Plutarch later recorded that the land redistribution created thousands of these plots in Messenia specifically, suggesting a massive transfer of property on a scale unprecedented in Greek history. But here's where the Spartan solution differed from typical Greek conquest. Usually conquered people were either killed, enslaved, and sold abroad, or forcibly relocated. The Spartans did none of these things. They needed the Messenians exactly where they were, because Spartan citizens weren't going to work the land themselves. The entire Spartan social system was predicated on creating a warrior elite free from economic labour. So the Messenians remained on their ancestral farms, but now as Helots, a word that probably derived from the Greek term for prisoners of war captured by the spear. The terms of Helotage were comprehensive and brutal. Helots were bound to the land in perpetual servitude, forbidden to leave their estates, required to surrender half of everything they produced to their Spartan masters. They worked the fields that had once belonged to their families, tended olive groves their grandfathers had planted, harvested crops that would feed the warriors who had conquered them. They couldn't be bought or sold individually like chattel slaves. They belonged to the Spartan state, not to individual masters, but that provided no protection, only a different form of bondage. They lived in their own communities, maintained family structures, and continued speaking their own dialect. And that was the fatal mistake, the seed of Sparta's future nightmare. Most slave societies intentionally fragment their enslaved populations, mixing people from different regions and cultures to prevent unified resistance. But Sparta needed Helots to remain in place, concentrated in their homeland, maintaining the agricultural infrastructure. They created a conquered nation within their own borders, a nation that would never forget it had once been free. The numbers were terrifying from the start. Ancient historians provide various estimates, but all agree on one fundamental point. The Helots vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. Herodotus, writing about the Persian Wars more than 2 centuries later, mentions that at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, 7 Helots accompanied every Spartan warrior. If that ratio held from the earliest days of conquest, and there's no reason to think it didn't, since it reflected the fundamental population disparity between Messenia and Laconia, it meant Sparta had created an internal enemy that outnumbered them 7-1. Some modern historians argue for more conservative estimates, perhaps 4-1. But even that lower ratio describes an existential nightmare. Imagine living in a society where for every one of you, there are 4 or 7 people who hate you, who remember when they were free, who tell their children stories about the old days before conquest. The Greek writer Krypteia, reflecting on the Spartan predicament, called the Helots a potentially active human volcano, a metaphor so perfect it captures everything about Sparta's self-inflicted crisis. The comparison to other Greek slave systems makes the Spartan situation even more obviously insane. In Athens, slaves came from everywhere: Thracians, Scythians, Egyptians, Persians, people captured in various wars or purchased from slave markets across the Mediterranean. They had no common language beyond broken Greek, no shared cultural identity, no ability to organise collectively. They were scattered throughout Athenian homes and workshops, isolated from each other with no possibility of unified resistance. An Athenian slave revolt was theoretically possible, but practically impossible, because the slaves couldn't communicate effectively or coordinate action across linguistic and cultural barriers. But Messenian Helots spoke Greek, the same dialect they had always spoken. They lived in concentrated communities in their original homeland. They had shared cultural practices, religious traditions, and most dangerously, a shared historical memory of freedom and independence. Every Helot child grew up hearing about the kings of Messenia, about Mount Ithome and the Long Resistance, about how the Spartans were invaders who had stolen what wasn't theirs. This created a toxic psychological environment for the Spartans that ancient historians explicitly commented on. Thucydides, the greatest historian of the classical age, wrote that most Spartan institutions have always been designed with a view to security against the Helots. Think about that statement. Most Spartan institutions. Not some, not a few, but most. The entire architecture of Spartan society, the laws, the customs, the military training, the social organisation, was fundamentally shaped by fear of the enslaved majority. Sparta didn't develop its famous military culture because they loved war or valued glory above all else. They developed it because they were terrified. They were a garrison force occupying hostile territory, and the hostile territory was their own country. They couldn't relax. They couldn't assume loyalty. They couldn't take for granted that their farms would be worked or that the food supply would arrive without interruption. Every harvest season could potentially become a revolt. Every gathering of Helots for a festival or market day could turn into a conspiracy meeting. The ancient writer Socrates claimed the Helots were treated more harshly than any other enslaved population in Greece, and the evidence supports that assessment. But here's the crucial point. Sparta's brutality toward Helots wasn't pathological sadism for its own sake. It was calculated terrorism born from rational fear. The Spartans understood exactly what they had done. They had created a system where their prosperity depended on the labour of a massive population that hated them. They had trapped themselves in permanent insecurity, and the only solution they could conceive was to make the cost of resistance so high, the psychological pressure so constant, that Helots would never dare to organise. So they built an elaborate architecture of terror designed to fragment Helot identity, crush Helot leadership before it could emerge, and ensure that every Helot understood that even thinking about freedom could mean death. The most infamous instrument of Spartan control was the Krypteia, an institution so brutal that even other Greeks found it shocking. The Krypteia was a secret police force, but calling it that doesn't capture the full horror of what it represented. Every year, young Spartan men who had distinguished themselves in the Agoge training system were selected for Krypteia service. These weren't just any young men. They were the most capable, the most ruthless, the ones who had proven they could kill without hesitation. They were given minimal supplies, sent into the Messenian countryside, and told to survive by their wits while completing a specific mission: identify and assassinate Helots who showed signs of leadership potential. The criteria were straightforward. Any Helot who seemed too intelligent, too physically strong, too respected by other Helots, or who showed any sign of independent thinking became a target. The Krypteia operated at night, moving through Helot communities in darkness, observing, noting, and when they identified a target, killing them without warning or trial. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic decapitation of potential Helot leadership, generation after generation. Any Helot who had the intelligence to organise resistance, the physical capability to fight, or the charisma to inspire others was murdered before they could become dangerous. The Krypteia sent a clear message to the Helot population. Mediocrity was safety, but excellence was death. If you worked hard enough to draw attention, if you spoke eloquently enough to be noticed, if you demonstrated any qualities that might make you a leader, armed killers would come in the night and your body would be found in a ditch. The psychological impact was devastating. It enforced learned helplessness, crushing Helot ambition before it could develop. It made collaboration impossible because any Helot who seemed capable enough to lead a revolt would be dead before they could organise anything. and it was completely legal because Sparta had developed a legal fiction so chilling it reveals the depths of their systematic approach to terror. The annual declaration of war on Helots, as discussed earlier, provided religious and legal sanction for Krypteia operations. By formally declaring war each year, the Ephors removed all religious barriers to killing Helots, transforming what would otherwise be murder into sanctioned wartime action. This legal fiction weaponized religion itself as an instrument of oppression. The public humiliation was equally calculated. Helots were required to wear distinctive clothing, dogskin caps and rough cloaks, that marked their status wherever they went. They could never blend in, never pretend to higher status, never escape the visible brand of their subjugation. At Spartan feasts and celebrations, Helots were deliberately intoxicated and forced to perform degrading acts to entertain their masters. They were made to sing obscene songs, perform crude dances, and engage in behaviour that Spartans would consider shameful. But this wasn't just cruel entertainment. It was pedagogical terrorism aimed at young Spartans. Boys growing up in Sparta were required to watch these spectacles as part of their education. The message was explicit. This is what inferior beings look like. This is what happens when you lack discipline and training. These Helots are subhuman creatures worthy only of contempt. By forcing Helots to perform degradation and forcing young Spartans to watch it, the system indoctrinated each new generation into accepting Helot subhumanity as natural fact. The Helots were also prohibited from any form of martial training. They couldn't own weapons, couldn't practice combat skills, couldn't gather in large groups without Spartan supervision. During harvest times, when Helots necessarily gathered in larger numbers, Spartan military presence increased proportionally. The economy of Messenia was structured to keep Helots fragmented, each tied to their individual kleros, isolated from broader organisation, unable to coordinate action across communities. When Helots had to move between locations, they needed permission. When they travelled, they were monitored. The entire system was designed around a single principle: prevent Helot unity at all costs. The Spartans understood that their military superiority couldn't overcome a coordinated Helot uprising, simply due to the overwhelming numbers disparity. Their only chance at maintaining control was ensuring that Helots never had the opportunity to coordinate, never had the leadership to organise, and never had the weapons to fight. By the time Mounted Home fell and the Helot system was fully established, Sparta had achieved exactly what it set out to do. The conquest had taken 20 brutal years, but now Sparta controlled twice its previous territory. Every Spartan citizen received a kleros estate in Messenia, worked by Helots who surrendered half their production. This economic arrangement meant Spartan men could dedicate their entire lives to military training rather than agricultural labour. They didn't need to work their fields because Helots did it for them. They didn't need to worry about harvest failures because even half of Messenia's abundant production was more than enough to sustain the Spartan population. The wealth flowing into Sparta transformed the city-state. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increased luxury goods, artistic production, and cultural development. The conquest had made Sparta rich beyond their previous imagination, but they had paid a price that wouldn't become fully apparent for decades. They had created an internal enemy that could never be defeated, only suppressed. The Helots weren't going anywhere. They couldn't be expelled because Sparta needed their labour. They couldn't be killed en masse because dead Helots don't farm fields. They couldn't be scattered because the entire economic model required them to remain on their ancestral lands, maintaining the agricultural infrastructure. So Sparta was permanently trapped in a toxic relationship with a population that vastly outnumbered them and hated them with generational fury. The conquest that was supposed to solve Sparta's land shortage had created a security crisis that would dominate Spartan policy for centuries. The psychological toll on Spartan society was immediate and profound. Where Athens would develop democracy, philosophy, drama, and empire, Sparta would develop paranoia. Where other Greek cities sent their young men, To gymnasia to study poetry and mathematics, Sparta would send theirs to the Agoge to learn killing. Where other states celebrated festivals and built temples, Sparta would declare war on its own population and send death squads into the countryside. The conquest of Messenia didn't just change Spartan economics, it warped Spartan society into a permanent military garrison living in perpetual fear. Thucydides observed that fear of Helots governed all Spartan policy, and the evidence supports that observation completely. Sparta couldn't participate in prolonged foreign campaigns, because that would mean leaving Helot territory unguarded. They couldn't risk significant military casualties, because that would shift the population balance even further toward the Helots. They couldn't allow cultural or economic development that might soften their military edge, because their survival depended on maintaining overwhelming tactical superiority over a numerically superior internal enemy. The Spartan mindset is captured in an ancient tradition that claimed they feared a single Helot rebel more than 1,000 foreign invaders at their gates. That statement, more than any other, captures the existential terror that now defined Spartan existence. Foreign enemies could be defeated and sent home. An internal revolt by a population that outnumbered you 7-1, that knew your territory better than you did, that had legitimate grievances and burning hatred. That was an apocalyptic scenario Sparta had no solution for, except preventing it through constant terroristic suppression. The victory in Messenia had created what would now be called a failed state. A society so consumed by internal security concerns that it could never develop normally, could never relax, could never become anything except what the conquest had forced it to become. And the Helots hadn't forgotten. In their communities, away from Spartan eyes, they told stories. Stories about King Euphrates and his strategic brilliance. Stories about the ravine where Messenian tactical skill had outmaneuvered Spartan arms. Stories about Mount Ihome and the long resistance. Stories about Aristodemus and his terrible sacrifice. Most importantly, they told stories about freedom, about the days before conquest when Messenia had been independent and Messenians had been citizens rather than slaves. Those stories were dangerous. Those stories kept alive the memory of an alternative reality, a world where Spartans were just neighbours rather than masters. Those stories nurtured hatred that would pass from generation to generation, father to son, mother to daughter for decades. The Helots worked Spartan fields during the day, but at night they dreamed of fire and blood. They remembered kings and heroes. They remembered freedom, and they were waiting. Within a generation, that memory would explode into the most terrifying crisis Sparta had ever faced. The Helots would rise under a leader whose name would become legendary, whose exploits would rival the heroes of epic poetry, whose rebellion would bring Sparta to the edge of total destruction. The first Messenian War had created the Helot system and the Spartan state it supported. The second Messenian War would nearly destroy both. And Sparta's response to that near-death experience would forge them into the militarized society history remembers, an entire civilization consumed by fear, defined by brutality, and transformed into an army of supermen by the nightmare they had created for themselves. For 2 generations after Mount Ihome fell, an uneasy peace settled over Messenia like ash after a fire. The Helots worked Spartan fields, surrendered half their harvests, and endured the daily humiliations of their subjugation. They wore their dogskin caps and rough cloaks. They performed degrading acts at Spartan feasts. They watched young men from the Krypteia move through their communities at night, identifying targets, eliminating anyone who seemed too capable or too respected. The machinery of terror ground on, year after year, crushing Helot identity and fragmenting Helot resistance before it could organize. To the Spartans, it must have seemed the system was working. The conquest was complete. The Helots were broken. Messenia belonged to Sparta forever. But memory doesn't die just because you terrorize the people who carry it. In Helot homes, grandparents told their grandchildren about the old days, about when Messenia had been free, about King Euphaes and his tactical brilliance, about Aristodemus and his terrible sacrifice on Mount Ithome. They told stories about the 20-year war, about how close Messenia had come to victory, about how Spartan treachery and brute force had stolen their freedom. These weren't just bedtime stories. They were acts of cultural preservation, passing down an identity that Sparta was trying to erase. Every child who heard these stories learned they were Messenian first, Helots second. They learned their grandparents had been free citizens of an independent kingdom. They learned that Sparta's dominance wasn't natural or eternal, but the result of conquest that could, theoretically, be reversed. Around 685 BC, roughly 40 years after the First Messenian War ended, something changed. The ancient sources don't tell us exactly what triggered it. Perhaps a particularly brutal Krypteia campaign. Perhaps a failed harvest that led to starvation while Spartans feasted on Helot labour. Perhaps simply the accumulation of decades of hatred reaching critical mass. But across Messenia, Helots began organising in secret. They coordinated between communities despite Spartan surveillance. They cached weapons stolen from Spartan armories or forged in hidden workshops. They identified leaders who could organise resistance, who had military experience from serving as attendants on Spartan campaigns, who remembered enough of the old Messenian military traditions to train others. And they waited for the perfect moment, the moment when Sparta's attention was divided, when their military was committed elsewhere, when the volcano could erupt before anyone could stop it. The catalyst came from an unexpected direction. Sparta's defeat at the Battle of Hesiae in 669 BC against Argos, one of Sparta's traditional rivals. The details of that battle are lost, but its impact was seismic. For the first time in living memory, the Spartan phalanx had been decisively defeated by another Greek army. The aura of Spartan invincibility shattered. News of the defeat spread across the Peloponnese like wildfire, and in Messenia the Helots saw their opportunity. If Argos could beat Sparta, maybe Messenia could too. If the Spartans could be defeated in open battle, maybe they weren't the unstoppable military machine they pretended to be. The Helots rose in coordinated revolt, throwing off the chains of slavery and proclaiming their intention to restore an independent Messenia. And they found a leader whose name would become legendary, whose exploits would be celebrated for centuries, whose very existence would haunt Spartan nightmares for generations. Aristomenes of Andania. Aristomenes was everything the Spartans had spent 40 years trying to prevent. He came from the Epetid family, one of the ancient noble lines of Messenia that traced its ancestry back before the conquest. His father was Nicomedes, or according to another tradition, Pyrrhus, and his mother was Nicotelia. He had grown up hearing the stories of Messenian independence, learning the names of the old kings, studying the tactics that had allowed Messenia to resist for 20 years in the First War. Somehow he had avoided the attention of the Krypteia despite being exactly the kind of intelligent, charismatic, physically capable individual they were supposed to eliminate. Perhaps his family had hidden his abilities, teaching him to appear mediocre in public while training him in private. Perhaps he'd simply been lucky. But when the revolt erupted, Aristomenes emerged as its natural leader, a man in his prime with military genius, inspirational charisma, and burning hatred for Sparta. The ancient historian Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century AD but drawing on earlier sources including the epic poet Rhianus, describes Aristomenes as a figure who combined tactical brilliance with almost supernatural courage. He was the kind of leader men would follow into certain death, the kind of commander who inspired absolute loyalty not through fear but through personal example. Where Spartan commanders directed their troops from behind the lines, Aristomenes fought in the front ranks, his armour always visible, his voice always audible, his sword always the first to strike enemy lines. He embodied everything the Messenians wanted to believe about themselves, that they were not inferior to Spartans, that with proper leadership they could win, their freedom, that courage and justice could triumph over brutality and oppression. The revolt secured the support of Argos and several Arcadian city-states almost immediately. Argos, having just humiliated Sparta at Hysiae, saw an opportunity to permanently cripple their rival by supporting a second front that would divide Spartan military resources. The Arcadians, who lived in the mountainous centre of the Peloponnese and had their own reasons to fear Spartan expansion, provided troops and supplies. With these allies and the mass uprising of Helots across Messenia, Aristomenes commanded an army large enough to challenge Sparta directly. This wasn't guerrilla resistance or isolated raids. This was organised warfare on a scale that threatened Sparta's entire Helot system. If Messenia won its freedom, what would stop the Laconian Helots from rising too? What would prevent the Perioikoi subject communities from demanding independence? The Second Messenian War wasn't just about territory, it was about whether Sparta's entire social and economic system would survive. The first major engagement came at a place called Deres, before the Argive and Arcadian reinforcements had even arrived. The details are frustratingly sparse, but the outcome was decisive. Aristomenes led the Messenian forces to a stunning victory over the Spartan army. Ancient sources say he fought with such extraordinary valour that after the battle, the Messenians offered him the crown, wanting to proclaim him king of an independent Messenia. It was the highest honour they could bestow, recognition that he had become the worthy successor to Euphaes and Aristodemus, that he embodied Messenian resistance and identity. But Aristomenes refused the kingship. He would accept only the title of commander-in-chief, the military leadership without the political authority. Perhaps he believed the kingship should go to someone with a stronger dynastic claim. Perhaps he thought the symbolism of a king implied they had already won independence when the war had just begun. Or perhaps he simply understood that leading armies and governing nations required different skills, and he was a warrior, not an administrator. What Aristomenes did next became the stuff of legend, an act of psychological warfare so audacious that Greeks would tell the story for centuries. One night, accompanied only by a handful of trusted companions, he crossed the mountains into Spartan territory. He moved through enemy lands under cover of darkness, evading patrols and guard posts, and made his way into Sparta itself, the heart of enemy territory, the city whose military reputation made it seem impregnable. His target was the temple of Athena Chalkoikos, Athena of the Brazen House, one of the most sacred sites in Sparta. The temple stood on the Acropolis, surrounded by bronze plates that gave it its distinctive name, a place where Spartans came to honour their patron goddess and pray for victory in war. Aristomenes crept into the temple precinct while the city slept. Inside, where Spartans hung shields captured from defeated enemies as offerings to the goddess, Aristomenes hung his own shield. And on that shield he had inscribed a message in clear Greek letters, dedicated to the goddess by Aristomenes from the Spartans. Not taken from the Spartans, but from the Spartans, as if the Spartans themselves had offered it, as if Aristomenes was acting on behalf of Sparta, as if he owned the city and everything in it. It was an act of breathtaking arrogance and calculated insult. The message was clear. Sparta couldn't protect its most sacred sites from Messenian infiltration, couldn't keep its enemies out of its own temples, couldn't guarantee the security even of its religious heart. If Aristomenes could walk into Athena's temple in the middle of Sparta and hang a shield, what couldn't he do? When the Spartans discovered the shield the next morning, the psychological impact was catastrophic. This wasn't just military humiliation, it was spiritual violation. Their goddess's temple had been profaned by a Helot rebel who had waltzed in and out without being detected. The shield hung there as proof of Spartan vulnerability, visible evidence that their security measures were inadequate, that their reputation for invincibility was illusion. Panic spread through the city. If Aristomenes could infiltrate Sparta once, he could do it again. If he could reach the temple, He could reach anywhere. Were there more Messenian agents already inside the city? How many Helots in Sparta were secretly loyal to the rebellion? The paranoia that already defined Spartan society intensified to fever pitch. In desperation, the Spartan authorities sent envoys to Delphi to consult the oracle. The question they asked reveals their state of mind. They needed divine guidance on how to defeat this enemy, who seemed to possess almost supernatural abilities. The oracle's response was cryptic, as Delphic pronouncements always were. Sparta needed to gain a leader from Athens. The advice was both militarily practical and politically significant. Athens and Sparta were not yet the bitter rivals they would become during the Peloponnesian War, but they represented fundamentally different Greek civilizations, Athens democratic and intellectual, Sparta oligarchic and military. For Sparta to seek Athenian help was an admission of desperation. They sent envoys to Athens, explained their predicament, and requested a general who could help them defeat Aristomenes. The Athenians, recognizing an opportunity to gain leverage over their powerful neighbour, sent a commander. Armed with Athenian tactical advice and desperate to erase the humiliation of the shield in the temple, the Spartans marched on the Messenians once again. The armies met at a place called the Boar's Grave, somewhere in the plain of Steniclarus, the same region where decisive battles of the First Messenian War had been fought a generation earlier. Both sides understood what was at stake. For Sparta, this was about restoring their military reputation and crushing the rebellion before it inspired other Helot populations to rise. For Messenia, this was about proving that Derus hadn't been a fluke, that they could consistently defeat Spartan armies in open battle, that independence was achievable rather than a fantasy. Aristomenes commanded the Messenian forces with his usual position in the front ranks where his soldiers could see him. The Spartan forces, bolstered by Corinthian allies and guided by Athenian tactical advice, deployed in their characteristic deep phalanx formation. The Battle of Boar's Grave became the stuff of Messenian legend. Pausanias and later sources describe Aristomenes fighting like a hero from Homer's epics, his sword and spear cutting through Spartan ranks, his voice rallying his troops at critical moments, his presence on the battlefield worth 1,000 ordinary soldiers, the Messenians, fighting for their freedom against the army that had enslaved their grandparents, matched Spartan discipline with desperate courage. For hours the battle raged across the plain, phalanx crashing against phalanx, the wounded falling between the lines, the dead piling up where the formations met. The Spartan phalanx, normally an unstoppable machine of coordinated violence, found itself matched and then exceeded by Messenian fury. Slowly, inevitably, the Spartan lines began to crack under the pressure. Gaps appeared in their formation. Units started falling back, and then the entire Spartan army broke, soldiers throwing down their shields and fleeing back toward Laconia in complete rout. The victory was total, decisive, and psychologically devastating to Sparta. They had brought their best troops, employed Athenian tactical advice, and still been comprehensively defeated by an army of former slaves led by a Helot rebel. Aristomenes had now defeated Sparta twice in major battles, first at Derus and now at Boar's Grave. The ancient sources claim that after each victory, Aristomenes performed a ritual sacrifice to the gods in thanksgiving, and that he vowed to sacrifice 100 enemies for every major victory. Whether this is literal truth or legendary embellishment, the story captures how Greeks viewed Aristomenes as a warrior of such extraordinary prowess that he could personally account for 100 enemy casualties. To Messenians, he was becoming more than a military commander. He was transforming into a symbol of resistance, a living embodiment of Messenian identity and hope. But to Sparta, Aristomenes was something far more terrifying. He was proof that the Helot system could be challenged, that Sparta's military superiority wasn't absolute, that everything they had built since conquering Messenia rested on foundations that could crack. The Spartans had won the First Messenian War through attrition and brutality, grinding down Messenian resistance over 20 years until mounted home finally fell. But Aristomenes wasn't fighting a defensive war from mountain fortresses. He was taking the offensive, marching into Spartan territory, defeating Spartan armies in their own lands. For the first time since the conquest, Sparta faced the real possibility of losing Messenia entirely, of watching their Helot system collapse, of seeing their entire society implode as the demographic nightmare they had created for themselves finally erupted with uncontrollable force. The Spartans regrouped, called up every available man, and prepared for what they knew might be a war of survival. They couldn't defeat Aristomenes in open battle. That much was clear from Derris and Boar's grave. So they turned to the tactics that had won them the First Messenian War: bribery, treachery, and patient brutality. Their target was Aristocrates, the king of Arcadia, whose forces fought alongside the Messenians as allies. The Spartans sent secret envoys with a proposal: betray the Messenians at the next major battle, withdraw your troops at the critical moment, and Sparta will reward you with territory, gold, and political alliance. It was the kind of cynical calculation that Sparta excelled at, recognizing that they couldn't win through military superiority alone but could win by corrupting their enemies' allies. Aristocrats accepted the bribe. The next major engagement came at a place called the Great Trench, or Great Fosse, a location whose exact geography is lost, but which provided the battlefield where Sparta's treachery would bear fruit. The armies deployed for what both sides expected to be a decisive confrontation. Aristomenes commanded the Messenian centre with Argive forces on the flanks, and Aristocrates' Arcadians in supporting positions. The Spartans advanced in their typical formation, the deep phalanx that had proven vulnerable to Messenian assault in previous battles, but which remained their core tactical doctrine. As the armies closed distance and the battle began, Aristomenes led his forces forward with characteristic aggression, driving into the Spartan lines, seeking to replicate the victories of Derris and Boar's grave. And then Aristocrates betrayed them. At the critical moment, as the Messenians were fully engaged with the Spartan front lines, Aristocrates ordered his Arcadian forces to retreat. But he didn't withdraw cleanly to the rear. He pulled his troops backward through the Messenian lines, creating chaos and confusion in the middle of combat. Messenian formations that were fighting Spartans to their front suddenly had Arcadian allies retreating through their ranks, breaking their cohesion, opening gaps in their lines. The Spartans, who had clearly coordinated this treachery in advance, immediately exploited the confusion. They drove forward into the gaps, turning what should have been a balanced engagement into a massacre. Messenian units found themselves surrounded, attacked from multiple directions, unable to maintain formation or coordinate their defence. Aristomenes fought desperately to salvage the situation, his tactical genius fully engaged as he tried to reorganize his disintegrating army. Ancient sources describe him fighting like a demon, holding together sections of the line through sheer force of personality, creating temporary defensive positions that allowed some units to retreat in good order. But even his extraordinary abilities couldn't overcome treachery of this magnitude. The Messenian army broke, soldiers fleeing back toward their fortified positions, leaving hundreds or thousands dead on the field at the Great Trench. The Spartans pursued ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing Helots with the particular brutality they reserved for rebellious slaves. By the day's end, the Messenian field army had ceased to exist as an organised fighting force. If this brutal origin story has changed how you see Sparta, hit that like button and share this video. History isn't about glory, it's about the dark compromises civilizations make to survive, and the terrifying costs of those compromises. We're uncovering the truth behind every legendary empire, every famous army, every civilization that textbooks sanitize. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next we're diving into another brutal origin story that history tried to bury. The algorithm doesn't always show you real history, so share this with someone who needs to know the truth. The survivors retreated to Mount Aera, a fortified mountain stronghold in southwestern Messenia that would become the centre of resistance for the next decade. Aera wasn't as spiritually significant as Itome. It lacked the ancient shrine to Zeus and the symbolic weight of the First War's last stand, but it offered similar military advantages. The mountain rose steep and defensible from the surrounding territory, its approaches difficult for any attacking army, its summit providing commanding views that made surprise assault nearly impossible. Aristomenes led the fortification efforts, transforming Aera into a fortress city that could sustain a siege indefinitely. Helot families from across Messenia fled to the mountain, seeking protection behind its walls. The Messenian resistance that had fought pitched battles in the open plains now became a siege defence, trading offensive capability for survival. But Aristomenes didn't intend to simply wait behind walls for the Spartans to starve them out. He understood that static defence had ultimately failed at Itome in the First War. Eventually, siege works and attrition would grind down any fortress, no matter how well defended. So he implemented a strategy that would turn the siege into a war of raids, transforming all of Messenia and southern Laconia into hostile territory for the Spartans. From Aera's fortified base, Aristomenes led raiding parties that struck at Spartan garrisons, confiscated grain stores, liberated Helot villages still under Spartan control, and generally made occupation of Messenia a bleeding wound for Sparta. These weren't random attacks, but coordinated guerrilla warfare designed to make the cost of maintaining the siege higher than Sparta could sustain. The ancient sources preserve accounts of Aristomenes' raids that border on the legendary. He would descend from Aera with 50 picked men, move through the countryside at night, strike at a Spartan garrison before dawn, and disappear back into the mountains before enemy reinforcements could respond. He knew the terrain intimately, every hidden path, every defensible pass, every source of water and food. The Spartans stationed in Messenia lived in constant fear. You might go to sleep in a garrison that seemed secure and wake to find Aristomenes' forces had infiltrated during the night and killed the sentries. You might be transporting supplies along a road that had been safe yesterday and find yourself ambushed from hillsides where Messenian archers waited. The psychological impact on Spartan forces was severe. They controlled the plains during daylight, but ceded the countryside to Aristomenes at night. For 11 years this stalemate continued. The Spartans couldn't storm Aera. Their assaults up the mountain slopes were repeatedly repulsed with heavy casualties, but they also couldn't abandon the siege without conceding defeat and admitting that Aristomenes had fought them to a standstill. So they maintained their encirclement, built siege works, cut off supply routes, and waited for attrition to do what their armies couldn't. Inside Aera, conditions gradually deteriorated. The initial population that had fled to the fortress was too large to sustain indefinitely on the food that could be grown on the mountain's limited arable land. The raids brought in supplies, but never enough. Children born during the siege grew up knowing nothing but warfare and deprivation. The elderly died from disease and malnutrition. The wounded from raids overwhelmed the medical facilities. But Aristomenes held them together through sheer force of will, his presence a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. During one of his raids into Spartan territory, Aristomenes' legendary luck finally ran out. The details are murky. Some sources say he was betrayed, others that he was simply overwhelmed by superior numbers during an engagement that went wrong. But the Spartans captured him along with 50 of his companions, bound them in chains, and marched them back towards Sparta for execution. The Spartans had waited years for this moment. Aristomenes was the symbol of Messenian resistance, the commander who had humiliated them repeatedly, the Helot who had dared to hang his shield in Athena's temple. His execution would be a propaganda victory worth more than any battlefield triumph. They decided he would die at the CONQUEST, a deep chasm on Mount Taygetus into which the Spartans traditionally threw criminals and people deemed unfit to live. The Spartans stripped Aristomenes' 50 companions naked and threw them into the Cerdas, watching them plummet to their deaths on the rocks below. But for Aristomenes, they made an exception. Ancient sources say they left him his armour because of his reputation for arete, for excellence, for virtue, for the qualities that even enemies had to respect. It was a gesture that seemed like honour but was actually the opposite. They wanted him to die with full awareness of his defeat, wearing the armour that had symbolised Messenian resistance, knowing that he had failed. They threw him into the chasm. He fell, armour and all, toward the rocks that had killed his 50 companions. And then, according to the legend that Pausanias preserves, something miraculous happened. An eagle appeared in the chasm, dove beneath Aristomenes as he fell and caught him, its wings buffeting the air to slow his descent. He landed not on the jagged rocks where the other Messenians had died, but on softer ground at the bottom of the chasm. Aristomenes lay there in the darkness, stunned but alive, surrounded by the corpses of his men. The chasm walls rose sheer above him, impossible to climb. There was no visible way out, just stone walls and the narrow opening hundreds of feet above where the Spartans had thrown him in. He searched the bottom of the chasm, looking for any gap, any crack, any possible escape route. The sources say he spent 3 days in that darkness, surviving on water that seeped through the rock walls, eating nothing, growing weaker but refusing to surrender to death. And then he saw the fox. A fox had entered the chasm through some hidden opening, perhaps drawn by the smell of the corpses. Aristomenes saw it and understood immediately. If the fox could get in, there must be a way out. He waited until the animal moved, then lunged and grabbed its tail. The startled fox tried to escape, pulling toward its entrance with Aristomenes holding on desperately. The fox led him to a narrow crack in the rock face, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, a passage that wound through the mountain's interior and eventually emerged on the outer slopes of Taygetus. Aristomenes crawled out into daylight, battered, starving, his armour damaged but still functional. He had survived the Cerdas where hundreds of criminals had died, escaped a chasm that was supposed to be inescapable, cheated death through a combination of divine intervention, if you believed in the eagle, and animal cunning, if you believed in the fox. He made his way back to Era, travelling at night, avoiding Spartan patrols, and arrived at the fortress to scenes of mourning. The Messenians had thought him dead, had begun preparing for a future without their legendary commander. When Aristomenes walked through the gates, still wearing the armour the Spartans had mockingly left him, the grief transformed instantly into jubilation. He was alive. He had escaped. The Spartans couldn't kill him. If that wasn't proof of divine favour, what was? But the war ground on, and Aristomenes' survival, miraculous as it was, didn't change the strategic reality. Sparta maintained its siege. Era's supplies continued dwindling. The raids brought in less and less as the Spartans learned to counter Messenian tactics, fortifying their garrisons and travelling in larger groups that were harder to ambush. The Spartans tried assault after assault and each was repulsed, but each also cost Messenian lives that couldn't be replaced. Attrition was working exactly as the Spartans had planned. And then they tried a different approach, negotiation under truce. The Spartans proposed a temporary cessation of hostilities to discuss terms. It was an obvious trap, but Aristomenes had to attend because rejecting the offer would demoralize his own forces. He went to the negotiation site with a small escort, understanding the risk but having no choice. Cretan auxiliaries serving with the Spartan forces, mercenary archers from Crete, who had no particular loyalty to either side but were being paid by Sparta, violated the truce and captured Aristomenes during the negotiations. It was a brazen violation of sacred Greek customs around Parlian truce, but Sparta had long since abandoned any pretense of following normal Greek warfare conventions when it came to Messenia. The Cretans bound Aristomenes and prepared to turn him over to Spartan authorities for execution. This time there would be no Cerdas, no chance of miraculous escape. They would simply execute him on the spot. But before they could carry out the sentence, something unexpected happened. A young Messenian woman approached the Cretan camp, alone and unarmed. Her name is preserved in some sources as one of the daughters of Aristomenes, in others simply as a Messenian maiden. She offered herself in marriage to the Cretan commander in exchange for Aristomenes' freedom. The negotiation that followed reveals fascinating cultural details about Greek warfare and honour codes. The Cretans were mercenaries with no ideological investment in Sparta's war against Messenia. They fought for pay, not patriotism. The offer of marriage from a woman connected to Messenian nobility represented substantial social value. After consultation, the Cretan commander accepted. He released Aristomenes in exchange for the marriage alliance, prioritizing personal advancement over his contract with Sparta. The young woman went with the Cretans, and Aristomenes returned to Aera. The sources say she later became his daughter-in-law rather than his wife, suggesting complex family negotiations occurred. But regardless of the exact details, the story illustrates the extraordinary devotion Aristomenes inspired. People were willing to sacrifice their freedom, their futures, their lives to keep him alive because he represented Messenian identity itself. Kill Aristomenes, and you killed Messenian hope. While he lived and fought, independence remained possible. The siege dragged into its 11th year. Inside Aera, people were starving. The elderly and sick had long since died. Children born during the siege knew nothing but warfare. The defenders were exhausted, malnourished, and psychologically drained from years of constant vigilance. The Spartans had learned patience, maintaining their blockade without attempting costly assaults, letting time and hunger do their work, and then, around 668 BC by Pausanias's chronology, a Messenian traitor opened communications with the Spartan command. The sources don't preserve his name or his motivations. Perhaps he was simply exhausted and saw no path to victory. Perhaps the Spartans had bribed him. Perhaps he had a personal grudge against Aristomenes, but he provided intelligence about Aera's defences, about guard rotations and weak points in the fortifications, about when and where the Spartans could strike with maximum effectiveness. The Spartans prepared a final assault based on this intelligence. They moved troops into position quietly, avoiding detection by Messenian scouts. They chose a night when weather conditions favoured the attackers, perhaps fog or rain that would muffle sounds and reduce visibility. And they struck with overwhelming force at the weak point the traitor had identified. The attack caught the defenders partially unprepared. Aristomenes rallied his forces, fighting from wall to wall, contesting every foot of the fortress. Ancient sources describe him making a heroic last stand, his sword taking Spartan lives even as the fortress crumbled around him. But heroism couldn't overcome treachery and exhaustion. The Spartan forces broke through the fortifications, poured into Aera's interior, and the fortress fell. In the chaos of Aera's fall, the Spartans made a calculated decision that reveals both pragmatism and propaganda awareness. They allowed the women, children, and Aristomenes himself to evacuate. Some historians interpret this as mercy, but the strategic calculation is more plausible. Killing Aristomenes in the fortress's fall would have made him a martyr, a heroic figure who died defending Messenia to his last breath. Letting him escape meant he remained alive but defeated, a symbol of failure rather than martyrdom. It also reduced the propaganda impact of Aera's fall. The Spartans could claim they had shown mercy, that they weren't monsters, that reasonable surrender would be respected. The women and children served as living proof that Sparta could be magnanimous in victory, which might encourage other pockets of resistance to surrender rather than fight to the death. Aristomenes led the survivors out of Aera and retreated with Arcadian allies who remained loyal despite Aristocrates' earlier betrayal. The Messenians who remained behind, the men of military age who couldn't or wouldn't flee, were re-enslaved as Helots. Those who managed to escape Aera faced a desperate choice: remain in Greece as refugees dependent on foreign charity, or abandon the Greek world entirely. Many chose the latter, fleeing to Italy where Greek colonies in Magna Graecia would accept them. These Messenian exiles would preserve their cultural identity in foreign lands, passing down stories of Aristomenes and the Great Rebellion to children who would never see Messenia. Aristomenes retreated to Arcadia with his remaining followers, but he wasn't done fighting. He hatched a desperate plan to seize Sparta itself in a surprise attack during a festival when the Spartans would be gathered for celebrations rather than combat readiness. It was audacious to the point of madness, but desperation breeds audacity. If Aristomenes could capture Sparta, he could potentially force a negotiated settlement that would restore Messenian independence. But before the plan could be executed, Aristomenes, the Arcadian king who had betrayed Messenia at the Great Trench, learned of it and moved to sabotage the attack. Aristocrats had accepted Spartan bribes once and remained in their pocket, prioritizing his alliance with Sparta over any remaining loyalty to the Messenian cause. He alerted Spartan authorities to Aristomenes' plan. The surprise was ruined. The attack never happened. But Aristocrates' treachery caught up with him. The Arcadian population, many of whom had fought alongside Messenians and respected Aristomenes as a hero, were outraged by their king's betrayal. The ancient sources say Aristocrates paid with his life for his treachery, though whether this was formal execution, assassination, or death in an internal Arcadian power struggle isn't clear. The message was unmistakable. Even in societies that valued pragmatic politics, there were lines you didn't cross, and betraying allies to their enemies was one of them. But Aristocrates' death didn't help Aristomenes. His army was gone. Era had fallen. The Messenians were re-enslaved. The rebellion had failed. Aristomenes left Arcadia and travelled to Rhodes, a wealthy island in the southeastern Aegean where his son-in-law Damogetius had become king. Rhodes offered sanctuary, prosperity, and distance from Sparta's reach. But Aristomenes couldn't accept peaceful retirement while Messenia remained enslaved. According to Pausanias, he spent his final years planning an ambitious diplomatic mission to the great Eastern empires, to Lydia and Media, the kingdoms that controlled vast territories and resources in Asia Minor and beyond. His plan was to secure military and financial support from these powers to convince them that supporting Messenian independence would weaken Sparta and serve their own strategic interests. It was geopolitical thinking on a scale far beyond typical Greek warfare, recognizing that Messenia's struggle couldn't be won through local military action alone, but required reshaping the broader balance of power. The sources don't tell us whether Aristomenes ever departed on this diplomatic mission or died before he could implement the plan. The fact that no Eastern intervention materialized suggests either he died before leaving Rhodes or his diplomatic overtures were rejected. But the plan itself reveals how Aristomenes thought, not as a simple rebel leader, but as a strategic thinker who understood international relations and power politics. He died on Rhodes, honoured as a hero by his son-in-law's court, but forever exiled from the homeland he had fought to free. After his death, his body was initially buried on Rhodes. But centuries later, when the Thebans helped Messenia finally win its independence in 369 BC, the Messenians fetched Aristomenes' bones from Rhodes and reburied them with honour in the newly liberated Messenia. They built a tomb surmounted by a column, erected a statue in the stadium, and instituted heroic honours that continued for centuries. His exploits became the subject of popular song, epic poetry, and cultural memory that sustained Messenian identity even under Spartan rule. The Second Messenian War ended around 650 BC, roughly 10 to 15 years after it began, depending on which ancient chronology you follow. The Spartans had won, but the victory felt nothing like the triumph of the First War. They had nearly lost. Aristomenes had defeated them twice in major battles. He had infiltrated their capital and desecrated their most sacred temple. He had held out for 11 years on Mount Era, raiding with impunity, killing Spartan soldiers, making occupation of Messenia a nightmare. Even after Era fell and Aristomenes went into exile, pockets of Messenian resistance continued fighting for years, localized resistance that may have lasted until the end of the century. The Spartans had been forced to bribe their allies to betray Messenia. They had been unable to defeat Aristomenes through military superiority alone. They had won through treachery, attrition, and patient brutality, exactly the same methods that won them the First War. But the psychological trauma was infinitely worse this time. The First War had been a conquest of foreigners, Messenians who were free citizens of an independent state before Sparta attacked them. The Second War was a revolt by Helots, by people Sparta had already defeated and supposedly broken. It meant the terror system hadn't worked. It meant 40 years of Krypteia assassinations, public humiliation, and systematic oppression had failed to erase Messenian identity or crush Helot resistance. It meant that no matter how brutal Sparta was, no matter how comprehensive their control, the Helots would never truly accept slavery. They would simply wait for the next opportunity to rise. The ancient historian Thucydides would later write that most Spartan institutions were designed with a view to security against the Helots, and the Second Messenian War proved exactly why that was necessary. The Spartans conducted a brutal post-war repression that makes their previous terror system look almost restrained by comparison. They re-enslaved all Messenians who hadn't escaped abroad. They intensified the Krypteia operations, eliminating Helots with even the slightest hint of leadership potential. They increased military presence in Messenia, stationing permanent garrisons in every significant town. They implemented tighter economic controls, taking not just half of Helot production, but enough to ensure Helots lived constantly on the edge of subsistence, unable to accumulate resources that might support another rebellion. Most importantly, they recognized that their existing social system, the one that had allowed them to nearly lose Messenia, was inadequate for permanent control of a hostile population that outnumbered them 7-1. The trauma of the Second Messenian War posed a fundamental question for Sparta. How do you control a massive enslaved population that has proven it can organize effective military resistance, that has produced a leader of Aristomenes' caliber, that has nearly destroyed you once and could potentially do it again? The answer they developed would transform Sparta from a typical Greek city-state into the most militarized society the ancient world had ever seen. They would implement reforms that turned every aspect of Spartan life into an instrument of Helot control. They would create a training system so brutal it produced warriors who could face overwhelming numerical odds without flinching. They would subordinate everything — art, culture, family, individual freedom, economic development — to a single goal: maintaining control over Messenia. The Second Messenian War had nearly killed Sparta. The reforms that followed would create an army of supermen, but at a cost that would ultimately doom Sparta to cultural sterility and eventual decline. In the aftermath of the Second Messenian War, Sparta faced an existential question that had no easy answer. They had won the war, but the victory felt hollow. They had reconquered Messenia, but at what cost? The Helot system that was supposed to provide economic security had nearly destroyed them. Aristomenes had come within a knife's edge of liberating Messenia and shattering the entire foundation of Spartan society. The terror apparatus of the Krypteia, the annual war declarations, the public humiliations, all of it had failed to prevent a rebellion that lasted over a decade and killed thousands of Spartan citizens. The system wasn't working. Something fundamental had to change, because another Aristomenes, another decade-long revolt might finish what the Second War had started. The Spartans looked at their society with brutal honesty and recognized the core problem. They were outnumbered 7-1 by a population that hated them, that remembered freedom, that would rise again given any opportunity. Normal Greek city-states could afford to focus on commerce, art, philosophy, and democratic governance, because they didn't live on top of the demographic volcano. Athens could develop drama and rhetoric because Athenian slaves were scattered and fragmented. incapable of coordinated resistance. Corinth could build commercial fleets because Corinthian economic slaves came from diverse backgrounds with no shared identity. But Sparta couldn't be normal because Sparta's economic foundation was a conquered nation that vastly outnumbered the conquerors. Every aspect of Spartan life had to be subordinated to one overwhelming imperative: maintaining control over the Helots. And that required transforming Sparta into something unprecedented in the Greek world, a totalitarian military state where every citizen was a full-time warrior. The reforms that followed the Second Messenian War were so comprehensive, so radical, and so enduring that ancient Greeks themselves struggled to understand how they had been implemented. The changes touched every aspect of Spartan life: political structure, economic organization, family relationships, education, military training, social customs, even what Spartans ate and how they dressed. The Greeks couldn't believe a society could transform itself so completely through rational planning, so they attributed the reforms to a single legendary lawgiver named Lycurgus, a semi-mythical figure who supposedly travelled to Delphi, received the oracle's blessing, and returned to Sparta with a complete constitutional system that remained unchanged for centuries. Modern historians debate whether Lycurgus was a real person or a mythological construct created to explain evolutionary changes. But what's undeniable is that sometime in the mid-7th century BC, right after the Second Messenian War, Sparta underwent revolutionary transformation from a relatively typical Greek city-state into the militarized society that would dominate Greek warfare for the next 300 years. The reforms had a clear author, even if that author was collective rather than individual. They were born from the trauma of nearly losing everything, from watching Aristomenes infiltrate Sparta itself and hang his shield in Athena's temple, from seeing the Spartan phalanx broken at Derazanbor's grave, from spending 11 years unable to dislodge Helot rebels from Mount Era. Every institution the reforms created, every law they implemented, every custom they established served a single purpose: ensure that Sparta would never again come so close to destruction. The Greeks called the new system eunomia, good order, good governance, the perfect functioning of a well-designed machine. But it was more accurate to call it what it really was: a society organised entirely around fear, transformed by paranoia into an instrument of perpetual warfare. The constitutional foundation of the new Sparta was the Great Retra, the Great Proclamation that established the basic political structure. According to tradition, Lycurgus received this document from the oracle at Delphi, giving it divine sanction that made the system unquestionable and unchangeable. The Great Retra wasn't written down. Lycurgus supposedly forbade written laws, arguing that the constitution should live in the character and customs of citizens rather than on tablets that could be altered or debated. This oral tradition made the system simultaneously flexible and rigid. Flexible because specifics could be adjusted, rigid because the core principles became sacred custom rather than revisable legislation. The result was a political structure that would remain fundamentally unchanged for centuries, adapting to circumstances while maintaining its essential character. The Great Retra established a mixed constitution that combined elements of monarchy, oligarchy, and limited democracy in a balance designed to prevent any single faction from dominating. Sparta retained its ancient dual kingship, with two royal families, the Agiads and Eurypontids, each providing one king who ruled simultaneously. This bizarre arrangement had practical military advantages. One king could lead the army abroad while the other remained home to guard against Helot revolt. But it also created a built-in system of checks and balances where neither monarch could become too powerful because the other provided a counterweight. The kings held religious authority and military command, but their political power was severely constrained by the other constitutional bodies. Real political power resided with the Gerousia, a council of 28 elders plus the two kings, making 30 members total. To qualify for the Gerousia, you had to be a Spartan citizen over 60 years old, and selection was for life. The ancient sources describe a bizarre election process where candidates appeared before the assembly, and whichever candidate received the loudest shouting was selected, a system designed to favour men with widespread popular support and respected military records. The Gerousia prepared legislation for the assembly, acted as a supreme court for criminal cases including charges against the kings, and could veto decisions made by the popular assembly if they judged those decisions unwise. It was an oligarchic body representing the older generation, the men who had survived decades of military service and therefore presumably possessed the wisdom and judgment to guide the state. Below the Gerousia stood the Appella, the assembly of Spartan citizens over 30 years old who had completed the Agoge training and maintained membership in a Sicilian mess hall. The Appella voted on proposals presented by the Gerousia, elected the ephors and members of the Gerousia, and made decisions about war and peace. But the Appella's power was more limited than in democratic Athens. Citizens could vote yes or no on proposals but couldn't debate them or offer amendments. The Gerousia controlled the agenda completely, and if the Gerousia judged that the assembly had made the wrong decision, they could simply dismiss the vote as crooked and ignore it. This limited democracy ensured that popular passion couldn't override elite judgment, a system designed for military efficiency rather than individual political freedom. The most distinctive constitutional innovation was the ephorate, 5 magistrates elected annually who exercised tremendous executive power. The ephors supervised the kings, presided over the Gerousia, executed decisions of the assembly, and most importantly, oversaw the terror apparatus that controlled the Helots. Every year upon taking office, the ephors formally declared war on the Helots, maintaining the legal fiction that made Helot killing religiously permissible. They directed the Krypteia, approved assassinations of dangerous Helots, and generally managed the day-to-day repression that kept Messenia subjugated. The ephorate created a rotating executive that prevented permanent tyranny while ensuring continuous governmental function. No single person could become dictator, but the state itself maintained dictatorial power over its citizens and absolute power over its Helots. The Great Retro established political structure, but the deeper revolution was economic. The reform supposedly included a radical redistribution of land that created the kleros system. Every Spartan citizen received an inalienable land grant worked by Helots, who were bound to that specific plot. The ancient sources claim Lycurgus divided Laconia into 9,000 equal plots for Spartan citizens and 30,000 smaller plots for the perioikoi, the free but non-citizen communities that surrounded Sparta proper. Modern historians debate whether such a comprehensive redistribution ever actually occurred, or whether the sources retroactively attributed evolutionary changes to a mythical founding moment. But regardless of whether it happened all at once or developed gradually, the kleros system became the economic foundation of Spartan militarization. Each kleros was required to produce a minimum amount of barley, about 70 medimnoi annually, roughly enough to feed a family of 4 for a year plus surplus, along with wine, fruit and other agricultural products. The Helots worked the land and surrendered approximately half their production to the Spartan master who owned the kleros. But crucially, the kleros couldn't be sold, divided among heirs, or used as collateral for loans. It passed intact from father to eldest son, ensuring that each generation of Spartans maintained the economic independence necessary for full citizenship. This economic arrangement freed Spartan men from agricultural labour, allowing them to dedicate their lives entirely to military training and warfare. Where Athenian citizens had to work, their farms or engage in commerce to survive, creating a part-time citizen-soldier militia, Spartan citizens were professional warriors from age 20 to 60, supported entirely by Helot agricultural labour. The system created a toxic economic dependency that reinforced paranoia about Helot rebellion. Every Spartan citizen's survival, his food, his citizenship status, his entire social position, depended on Helots continuing to work his Kleros and surrender their production. If the Helots revolted successfully and stopped working the fields, Spartan citizens would starve. This absolute economic dependency on a hostile enslaved population meant Sparta could never relax its military vigilance, could never allow its warrior edge to dull, could never develop the kind of commercial or artistic culture that would distract from military preparedness. The entire economy was structured around a single imperative: maintain overwhelming military superiority over the Helots, because if you ever lose that superiority, they will rise again, and you will lose everything. The reforms also supposedly abolished coinage and mandated that Sparta use only iron currency that had been deliberately devalued by heating and quenching in vinegar, making it soft and bulky and worthless outside Laconia. Whether this actually happened or is another mythical attribution to Lycurgus, the effect was real. Sparta developed an economy with minimal external trade, no merchant class and limited wealth accumulation. Spartan citizens couldn't get rich through commerce because commerce was effectively prohibited. The only wealth that mattered was the kleros, which couldn't be sold or accumulated. The result was a remarkably egalitarian society among the citizen class. All Spartans were supposed to be economic equals, neither rich nor poor, all sustained at the same level by their kleroi. This equality eliminated the kind of class conflict that plagued other Greek cities, where the poor resented the rich, and political instability resulted from economic inequality. Every Spartan was equal, every Spartan was a warrior, and every Spartan's prosperity depended on maintaining control over the Helots. But the most revolutionary aspect of the Lycurgan reforms was the Agoge, the comprehensive state-controlled education and training system that transformed Spartan boys into warriors unlike any the Greek world had seen before. The Agoge wasn't just military training, it was total social engineering, a systematic program to create men who would value collective duty over individual desire, who would face death without flinching, who would maintain formation discipline under overwhelming pressure, who would kill Helots without moral hesitation. The Agoge began at birth with inspection of newborns. Spartan tradition claims that weak or deformed infants were exposed on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, left to die from exposure, ensuring only the healthy survived to adulthood. Modern historians debate how literally to take these accounts, but the ideological message was clear. Weakness had no place in Sparta because weakness could mean defeat, and defeat meant Helot revolution and societal annihilation. At age 7, boys were taken from their families and enrolled in the Agoge system. They would spend the next 13 years in state-controlled dormitories, organised into age cohorts called herds, under the supervision of older boys, and state-appointed instructors called paidonomoi. The removal from family was deliberate. Primary loyalty had to be to the state and one's mess hall companions, not to parents or siblings. The boys slept in communal barracks on reed beds they'd gather themselves from riverbanks, using no tools but their bare hands. Supposedly tearing the reeds shredded their hands, toughening them for warfare. They were deliberately underfed, given insufficient rations and encouraged to steal food to supplement their diet. But if they were caught stealing, they were severely beaten, not for the theft itself, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. The message was explicit. Cunning, stealth, and resourcefulness were virtues, but only if executed with competence. The physical training was brutally comprehensive. Boys learned boxing, wrestling, javelin throwing, discus, running, and most importantly, phalanx fighting with shield and spear. They trained constantly, building strength, endurance, and pain tolerance. Later sources describe a ritual called diamastagosis, where boys were flogged at the altar of Artemis Orthia, competing to see who could endure the most lashes without crying out. Some reportedly died from the beating rather than show weakness. Modern scholars note that the most extreme accounts of this ritual come from the Roman period, though some form of endurance testing likely existed earlier. Regardless of when it reached its most brutal form, the ritual captures the ethos. Pain was to be endured, even embraced, because warriors who couldn't tolerate suffering would break in combat. The boys fought each other constantly, encouraged to use violence to establish dominance hierarchies within their age cohorts. Weakness was punished immediately by peers. A boy who couldn't defend himself would be beaten until he learned to fight back or washed out of the system entirely. But the Agoge wasn't just physical training. It included education designed to create intelligent, adaptable warriors rather than mindless brutes. Boys learned music and poetry, particularly the war poems of Tyrtaeus that celebrated death in battle and condemned cowardice. They learned to read and write, though Spartans valued concise communication, the famous laconic speech style that used minimum words for maximum impact. They learned rhetoric and logic through organised question and answer sessions, where boys had to defend their answers and accept criticism. The education emphasised practical military, knowledge, geography for campaign planning, astronomy for navigation, enough mathematics to organise supply logistics. Everything was subordinated to military utility. There was no philosophy for its own sake, no abstract mathematics, no artistic endeavour that didn't serve state purposes. The Agoge produced warriors who could think tactically and strategically, who could adapt to unexpected battlefield situations, who could command troops effectively, but who would never question the fundamental system that had created them. The culmination of Agoge training was selection for the Krypteia, that institution of terror we examined earlier, born from the first Messenian Wars' aftermath. Now formalised as the final stage of Spartan military education, the Krypteia served multiple purposes simultaneously, each reinforcing the system's internal logic. Not all young men were selected, only those who had distinguished themselves through exceptional performance, who had demonstrated the physical prowess, tactical intelligence, and psychological ruthlessness necessary for the mission. Around age 20, these select individuals received minimal equipment, a dagger, basic supplies, and were sent into the Messenian countryside with instructions to survive by their wits while hunting Helots. They moved at night, observed Helot communities during the day, identified individuals who showed signs of leadership capability or independent thinking, and assassinated them without warning or trial. The Krypteia served multiple purposes simultaneously, each reinforcing the system's internal logic. First, it eliminated potential Helot leadership before rebellion could organise. Any Helot who demonstrated intelligence, physical strength, oratorical ability, or charisma, the exact qualities that made someone dangerous as resistance leader, became a Krypteia target. The systematic assassination of capable Helots, generation after generation, ensured that Helot communities remained decapitated, unable to produce the Aristomenes figures who could lead successful revolts. It was preventive genocide, killing people not for what they had done, but for what they might become. Second, the Krypteia provided final stage training for young Spartans in practical military skills, reconnaissance, survival in hostile territory, moving undetected, killing efficiently and silently. These were exactly the skills Spartan officers needed for commanding armies and conducting special operations. The Helots became training targets for developing elite soldiers. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Krypteia served as psychological conditioning that destroyed any moral resistance to killing Helots. A Spartan youth in the Krypteia wasn't killing enemy soldiers in battle. He was assassinating unarmed agricultural workers, people who posed no immediate threat, people who were guilty only of being too capable or too respected in their communities. Crossing that moral line, proving you could murder civilians in cold blood, ensured that when the next Helot revolt erupted, Spartan soldiers would feel no hesitation in slaughtering rebels by the thousands. The Krypteia transformed normal human empathy and moral restraint into liabilities that had to be eliminated through blood initiation. By making young Spartans complicit in state terrorism, the system ensured their psychological investment in maintaining the terror apparatus forever. The annual declaration of war on Helots provided religious and legal sanction for Krypteia operations. Under normal Greek religious law, killing created miasma, spiritual pollution that offended the gods and required ritual purification. But killing enemies during wartime carried no such religious consequences. It was blessed violence rather than pollution. By declaring perpetual war on the Helots, Sparta removed all religious barriers to killing them. A young Spartan in the Krypteia who assassinated a Helot wasn't committing murder. He was killing enemies in a formally declared war, performing his patriotic duty, serving the state. The system weaponized religion itself, transforming genocide from a crime into a sacred obligation. And because the war declaration was renewed annually by the ephors, every generation of Spartans received explicit state permission and religious sanction to kill Helots whenever necessary for state security. At age 20, if a young Spartan successfully completed the Agoge and survived Krypteia service, he became eligible for full citizenship, but only if he was elected to a session, the communal mess halls that formed the core of adult Spartan social organization. There were approximately 15 to 20 syssitia in Sparta, each consisting of about 15 men who ate together daily and formed the basic military unit in combat. Admission required unanimous approval from existing members. A single blackball vote would exclude a candidate, sending him into a degraded social status where he was technically free but denied citizenship rights. The initiation process was deliberately opaque, creating intense anxiety as young men waited to learn whether they would be accepted or rejected by the mess they applied to join. Once admitted, membership in a session became the defining social relationship of a Spartan man's life. More important than family ties, more fundamental than relationships with wife or children. Each member contributed a fixed amount of barley, wine, cheese, and figs from their kleros production monthly. Any member who couldn't make their contribution would lose citizenship status and be expelled from the mess. The syssitia ate together every night without exception, consuming plain, deliberately unappetizing food designed to emphasize austerity over pleasure. The famous black broth that Spartans ate was supposedly so disgusting that foreign visitors who tasted it remarked that now they understood why Spartans were willing to die in battle. Life eating that food wasn't worth living. But the terrible food served an ideological purpose. Spartans weren't supposed to seek pleasure or comfort. They were supposed to value duty and discipline. The mess halls created intense unit cohesion that translated directly into battlefield effectiveness. Men who ate together daily, who knew each other's strengths and weaknesses intimately, who had trained together since age 7, who had shared the hardships of the Agoge, fought together as coordinated units rather than collections of individuals. In the phalanx formation where maintaining line integrity meant the difference between victory and massacre, this cohesion was tactically decisive. A Spartan phalanx didn't break under pressure, because each man knew that the men on either side of him were brothers in the most fundamental sense, and abandoning them would mean betraying the most important relationships in his life. The syssitia engineered loyalty that made the Spartan phalanx the most feared military formation in Greece for 3 centuries. But the syssitia also served social control functions. Spartan citizens were required to attend their mess every night. Absence without valid excuse drew severe penalties. This meant Spartan men couldn't develop private lives separate from state surveillance. They couldn't gather in secret to plot against the government or organize resistance to the system. Everything occurred under the observation of messmates who would report suspicious behavior to the ephors. The communal mess system turned every Spartan into a potential informant, creating internal surveillance that supplemented the external terror apparatus directed at Helots. The result was a society where privacy was minimal and conformity to state ideology was continuously reinforced through peer pressure and collective identity formation. By the early 6th century BC, perhaps 2 or 3 generations after the Second Messenian War, the transformation was complete. Sparta had become something unprecedented, a totalitarian military state where every aspect of society served a single purpose. Citizens were professional warriors from age 20 to 60, training constantly, eating in communal messes, living under perpetual surveillance, their entire identity constructed around military excellence and state service. The economy was structured to sustain this military class through helot labour, while preventing wealth accumulation that might create class divisions. The political system balanced monarchic, oligarchic and democratic elements to prevent tyranny while maintaining efficient executive function. The education system mass-produced warriors with standardized training that ensured tactical competence and psychological conditioning. The terror apparatus kept the helot population fragmented and leaderless through systematic assassination and public humiliation. The military effectiveness was undeniable. The Spartan phalanx became legendary throughout Greece, its discipline and cohesion unmatched by any other city-state. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, 300 Spartan warriors held a narrow pass against the entire Persian army, their willingness to die rather than retreat becoming the defining example of military valour for Western civilization. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, Spartan infantry broke the Persian line and secured Greek victory in the final major land battle of the Persian Wars. Throughout the 5th century BC, Sparta dominated land warfare in Greece. Other cities sent larger armies, but Spartan forces won through superior training, discipline, and tactical coordination. The Agoge had created what the Greeks called the equals, Spartan citizens who were identical in their military capability, their social status, and their absolute dedication to the state. But the cost was civilizational sterility. Everything that made other Greek cities vibrant cultural centres, philosophy, drama, art, commerce, democratic debate, scientific inquiry, architectural innovation, was sacrificed on the altar of military security. Athens produced Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides, the historian Thucydides, the orator Demosthenes. Sparta produced soldiers and nothing else. Where Athenian democracy allowed unprecedented political experimentation and intellectual freedom, Spartan oligarchy enforced rigid conformity to ancestral customs. Where other Greek cities built magnificent temples like the Parthenon, Sparta built barracks and training grounds. Where other cities accumulated wealth through trade and used it to fund artistic patronage, Sparta banned wealth accumulation and prohibited unnecessary luxury. The Spartan state resembled nothing so much as a permanent military garrison occupying hostile territory, which was exactly what it was. Spartans couldn't leave Laconia for extended periods without state permission, because depopulating the garrison meant inviting helot revolt. They couldn't engage in prolonged foreign wars because that would mean leaving Messenia unguarded. When Athens led the Delian League in the decades after the Persian Wars, building an Aegean empire that brought unprecedented wealth and power, Sparta couldn't participate because helot security required keeping the army at home. The system that had been created to ensure survival after the Second Messenian War had succeeded in its purpose. Sparta would never again come close to losing Messenia during the classical period, but that survival came at the cost of everything else. Sparta had transformed itself into a machine with a single function, and machines cannot easily be repurposed for other tasks. The reform successfully prevented another Aristomenes from emerging and nearly destroying Sparta. The Krypteia decapitated helot leadership systematically. The economic dependency on kleroi meant Spartans couldn't afford not to maintain military superiority. The Agoge produced warriors psychologically conditioned for perpetual vigilance and helot suppression. The entire system reinforced itself. Each generation of Spartans was indoctrinated into the same ideology, underwent the same brutal training, internalized the same fears, and transmitted the same values to the next generation. The result was remarkable social stability across centuries, Where other Greek cities experienced revolutions, coups, democratic reforms, and oligarchic counter-reforms, Sparta's constitution remained fundamentally unchanged from the 7th century BC through the 4th century BC, a span of 300 years. The system worked exactly as designed, but it worked by trapping Sparta in permanent siege mentality. The ancient historian Plutarch, writing 600 years after Lycurgus supposedly implemented his reforms, described how Spartans leaving their city would glance behind them constantly, always vigilant for the Helot revolt they expected to erupt at any moment. Thucydides wrote that most Spartan institutions were designed with Helot security in mind, and everything else was secondary. The fear that had driven the creation of the system never dissipated. It was baked into Spartan identity so fundamentally that Spartans couldn't imagine any other way of life. They had created a machine designed for a specific threat, and that machine could only function if the threat remained constant. The Helots weren't just Sparta's economic foundation, they were its psychological foundation, the enemy that justified every sacrifice, every brutality, every limitation on freedom. When the Persian Empire invaded Greece in 480 BC, threatening to conquer the entire Greek world and reduce every city to slavery, the Spartans hesitated to send help because Helot security couldn't be compromised. When the Athenian messenger begged for Spartan assistance at Marathon in 490 BC, the Spartans cited religious obligations, but the subtext was clear. They couldn't send their army abroad while the Helots remained a threat. Only when the Persian invasion became absolutely existential did Sparta commit forces, and even then they sent only 300 warriors to Thermopylae, keeping the bulk of the army home to guard Messenia. The system that was supposed to ensure Spartan security had instead imprisoned Sparta, making them incapable of pursuing opportunities or responding to threats that might require extended military commitment away from home. The tragic irony is that Sparta's obsession with Helot control ultimately caused the decline they were trying to prevent. The Spartan citizen population that sustained the entire system was always small, perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 full citizens at the system's height in the early 5th century BC. But that number declined steadily over the following centuries as casualties mounted in various wars and the rigid citizenship requirements couldn't be met by sons whose fathers had lost their kleroi. By the 4th century BC, the citizen body had shrunk to a few thousand. By the Hellenistic period, there were fewer than 1,000 Spartan citizens. The system was demographically unsustainable, consuming its own manpower faster than it could reproduce. And when Thebes defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC and liberated Messenia the following year, ending nearly 400 years of Helot slavery, the Spartan state imploded almost overnight. Without Helot labour to sustain the kleroi, Spartan citizens lost their economic foundation. Without the Helot threat to justify total militarization, the entire social system lost its purpose. But for 3 centuries between the reforms of the mid-7th century and the liberation of Messenia in 369 BC, Sparta dominated Greek military affairs through a system born from pure terror. The Helot conquest created the demographic nightmare. The first Messenian War established the system. The second Messenian War nearly destroyed it. And the reforms that followed, the Great Retra, the Kleros redistribution, the Agoge, the Krypteia, the Syssitia, transformed Sparta into an army of supermen. But they were supermen created by fear, warriors whose excellence stemmed from paranoia, soldiers whose discipline emerged from a society-wide recognition that any weakness would mean their extermination. Ancient Greeks simultaneously admired and feared Sparta, recognizing their military prowess while being disturbed by the brutal social engineering that produced it. The Nazi regime in the 1930s looked to Sparta as an ideal model, praising the Agoge for weeding out the weak and creating a unified warrior society. The totalitarian implications were obvious: a state that controlled every aspect of citizens' lives from birth to death, that prohibited dissent or deviation, that valued collective duty over individual rights, that systematically eliminated populations deemed inferior. The comparison isn't coincidental. Sparta was what emerges when a society subordinates everything to security concerns, when fear becomes the organizing principle of civilization, when the external threat is used to justify any internal oppression. The Spartan system worked for its intended purpose, maintaining Helot control, but at the cost of cultural vitality, individual freedom, demographic sustainability, and ultimately, survival. The story of Sparta's origin reveals a truth about militarism that resonates across history. The perfect army history remembers wasn't born from glory or honour or martial tradition. It was forged from terror, paranoia, and the desperate recognition that Sparta had made a catastrophic mistake by enslaving an entire nation. Every institution the Greeks admired, the legendary discipline, the fearsome warriors, the austere culture, emerged as a response to the existential nightmare Sparta had created for itself. They weren't born great, they were forced to become great or die. The conquest of Messenia created the Helot system. The Helot revolts nearly destroyed Sparta, and the response to that near destruction created the army of Supermen whose reputation would outlast their civilization by 2,000 years. When you see the 300 at Thermopylae standing against the Persian horde, when you hear about Spartan valor and discipline, when you encounter the myth of Spartan excellence, remember where it came from. Remember the 20-year war of conquest. Remember the Helot children wearing dogskin caps marked as subhuman, living under annual war declarations. Remember Aristomenes hanging his shield in Athena's temple, Aristomenes surviving the Caiadas, Aristomenes nearly bringing Sparta to its knees. Remember the young Spartans in the Krypteia, hunting unarmed agricultural workers in the night, learning to kill without mercy. Remember the boys torn from their families at 7, beaten and starved and trained to endure suffering, transformed into human weapons. Remember that every aspect of the system, every law, every custom, every brutal practice, existed for one reason: to prevent another Helot revolt. The Spartans created an army of supermen, but they did it because they were terrified, and in the end, the system they built to ensure survival consumed them, leaving nothing behind but ruins and legends of warriors who sacrificed everything for a state that couldn't imagine any other way to live. This is the story they don't teach you in school. Sparta wasn't born from heroic tradition or ancient warrior culture. It was forged from a crime, the enslavement of an entire nation, and the paranoia that followed when that nation refused to accept subjugation. The First Messenian War created the Helot system and the demographic nightmare. The Second Messenian War brought Sparta to the edge of annihilation, proving that terror alone couldn't maintain control. And the response, the Lycurgan reforms, created the most militarized society in ancient history, an entire civilization engineered around a single purpose: preventing Helot rebellion. Every Spartan institution, every law, every aspect of the legendary discipline emerged from fear. The Agoge that produced perfect warriors existed because Sparta needed soldiers who could maintain formation against overwhelming numbers. The Krypteia that assassinated Helot leaders existed because Sparta couldn't survive another Aristomenes. The Syssitia that created unit cohesion existed because Sparta needed absolute loyalty from warriors who couldn't afford to break. Sparta became an army of supermen, but supermen created by trauma, warriors forged from paranoia, soldiers whose excellence cost them everything else that makes civilization worth living. The Helots eventually won their freedom in 369 BC when Thebes liberated Messenia, ending nearly 400 years of slavery. The Spartan state collapsed within a generation, proving that the entire system had been unsustainable from the beginning. But the legend survived. Western civilization remembers Sparta as the ultimate warrior culture, the society that valued duty over comfort, discipline over freedom, collective purpose over individual desire. We remember the 300 at Thermopylae, the laconic speech, the mothers telling their sons to return with their shields or on them. We remember the myth, but now you know the truth. You know about Ampheia and the massacre that started it all. You know about Mount Ihome and the 20-year siege. You know about Aristomenes and the shield in the temple, about the Chiadas and the eagle, about the rebellion that nearly destroyed Sparta. You know about the boys torn from their families, the young men hunting Helots in the dark, the systematic terrorism that maintained control for centuries. You know that Sparta's excellence wasn't born from glory, it was born from fear. That's the brutal truth of Sparta's origin. If this changed how you see history, subscribe to Wars in History for more stories that reveal the dark reality behind legendary civilizations. Like this video if you want more deep dives into the origins of famous military powers, the conquests, the revolts, the desperate reforms that created the armies history remembers. Comment below and tell me what other glorious civilization you want exposed next. Because every empire has an origin story and most of them are darker than you've been told. Thanks for watching, and remember, history isn't about heroes. It's about the brutal choices societies make to survive, and the price they pay for those choices.